The People's Tribunal is now in session.
Good morning to members of the panel. Just a little quick housekeeping, Your Honours. One is, yesterday we undertook to provide the biodata of the witness Jenny Lasimbang. We have made that available and placed that before Your Honours. And we have also, in our usual fashion, supplied a list of the witnesses that we hope to go through today, 9 witnesses. So with your leave, we are to continue with Dr. Tessa, Cik Mas, Jaliza, and Professor Zaharom for questions that the panel may wish to.
Yeah, you gave us a lot of information yesterday, and we had an opportunity last night, this morning, to look at your documents. But what we would like to do is to talk or to listen to you as to, I don't know how to put it, maybe remedial measures could be taken, because the way the media is organized and manipulated, it doesn't really provide the context in which information can be freely exchanged and views expressed, and to enable the voters to exercise their vote in a kind of rational way. And so I have a few sort of issues I want to raise, and I'm sure my colleagues have too. One question that I want to raise is whether you think there should be some regulation which restricts the ownership of the media by political parties. I know that in some countries, largely under anti-monopoly legislation, there are restrictions on ownership of the media that they read. I also want to know how the media is organized. There is some information on that, quite a bit. But if the media, if the journalists were organized in a union of their own, and were able to work together, then I think they will be in a stronger position to insist on independent reporting and fair comments than they seem to be at the moment. The impression I get is that it's from editors down to the person who goes to the magistrate's courts and writes stories. There is such a grip on them of the owners. So is it possible for journalists to organize themselves to increase their own autonomy? There are also forms of self-regulation in many countries. And are there any norms, conventions whereby the conduct of editors is regulated? You have mentioned certain norms that are expected to be binding in these circumstances, but what is their status? And as you may have as to how the press could be made more accountable and a bit more independent than they seem to be at the moment. I'm also quite disturbed to see the strong grip of the government on the media. And that certainly would in many countries be not allowed today. So again, your thoughts on that would be very welcome. Thank you. Now you want to answer that? You want my colleagues
I think we have raised at least 6 points.
Okay.
So
I think maybe Chairman, there's some clarifications about the assertions that you've put in that I'd like to have first. Those are, I think they probably then will answer some of the questions. But on the Dr. Tessa's paper, watching the watchdog, I thought was quite optimistic, watching the watchdog, assuming therefore, I suppose, that the media is the watchdog. But I noticed one of the conclusions you say is the, I tried to understand the all those graphs and statistics. What I could not quite understand was this cross-analysis media groups. How am I to understand this cross?
Political parties, or whether they just have bigger newspapers with more stories in them overall.
Okay. Secondly, I note that for East Malaysia, you do not split between Sabah and Sarawak.
No. No. Because we only had one paper in each language for both Sabah and Sarawak, so one English Sabah paper, one English Sarawak paper. So the individual reports show those papers individually, and then I just grouped it into East Malaysia just for the purpose of having a group rather than leaving them singly.
Okay, I think, and finally, on your conclusions, you say the impact of media coverage on electoral integrity is significant. How am I to understand that, and what statistics would show this?
I'm not sure that there are statistics, but if we kind of refer back to the initial assumptions that the way people learn about their political environment is through the media. I mean, in Malaysia there are charamas, people get chances to interact with their politicians directly, but those are kind of rare occasions for the most part. The way that we kind of daily get information about our political environment is through the media. So it's that information that is allowing us to form our opinions and then make our choices in terms of...
Okay. Yeah. In some of the comments that you... So may I just turn to Puan Mas Jaliza? In some of the comments you, where you quote your interviewees, you did say, for example, one said that they would, when they want to write, they would check with in-house legal department for defamation and the insistence, and then that sort of tones down their reporting or their writing or the absence of it altogether. So, does it run through the whole, the interviewers that you met, interviewees that you met?
For that particular response, that was only from one respondent. And my hypothesis is that unless you are someone who is very clued on in terms of what you think ethical media should be practicing, then unless you have that at the back of your mind, you wouldn't practice that. Often, if you look at how media, and I think in some ways, if you refer to Dr. Houghton's analysis and statistics, etc., you will find that a lot of the attacking articles...
That this was something that actually could be, well, positive in our environment rather than a negative one, because at least then it will stop the papers from simply publishing whatever one side says. So I was quite taken by that response. I was just wondering whether that was a question that you actually had posed to all the other interviewers and whether they then responded.
Your Honor, I don't pose the question directly and say, do you think defamation is? What I've done is that I asked them what the issues are. In that particular one, the editor actually shared with me, this is how we did it. And in some ways, what I've done as well is that I've extracted that as a possible best practice that can be done in the newsroom as a stopgap measure for the moment until the media environments change, until the media laws are reformed. This is one way to do it. And I think it's a sad condition on the country when we have to go the legal route every time in order to ensure that, fair reporting is practiced. We would go towards the way of being a litigious nation. And for defamation cases, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of money, a lot of resources would have to be put in order for that to be done.
On the students who are undergoing communications courses especially, we did a study many years ago, my colleagues and I, on this idea of, on various universities and the students looking at the overall curricula that they had, and based on our experiences as to what were seen as acceptable and non acceptable in terms of journalism training or media training, media education. And yes, at that point in time, my colleagues and I found that the communications education curricula, and in fact communications education at the tertiary level, was essentially very conservative, right? There was very little questioning of the context within which journalists and broadcasters would practice. Yeah. There was a lot of vocational type of courses that effectively trained the students in some universities at least on the basics of writing, for example. Yeah. But why? There were a lot. The main questions asked was how, essentially, the how questions. The why questions were hardly raised. Yeah. This was in the 1990s when we did. And as far as I know, the idea of education is essentially to get a job. Yeah. You come to universities, you get a degree and you get a job. It's never to question. Yeah. So that kind of conformity, it's not only Malaysia, I mean, it's done virtually in many, many other so-called developing countries. The idea of education as something that will lead to a job rather than education liberating the mind. Yeah? So that kind of conformity, that leads, we feel, to conformity. And we're not the only ones. There's been a lot of theoretical works done on this whole idea of education. Paulo Freire, for example, Brazilian education is the notion of the banking concept of education, yeah, that leads to that kind of conformity. Yeah.
So would I understand then that this conformist culture that is inculcated at this almost throughout your early education up to almost tertiary is almost difficult to reverse when you come, say, to your faculty?
Yeah, well, based on my experience in public universities, it is, of course, very difficult to reverse. I mean, when you get students questioning and then they get suspended and they're not allowed to continue with their education, there's a lot of pressure on students and even academic staff, I believe, in universities. Those external political pressures are definitely there, and they're felt by not only this.
This would be the example of probably if they, in sentences that you analyze, did you found objective coverage in a political party? That's first question. Question number two, what are the major form of bias shown by the mainstream media in Malaysia in terms of positive and negative, as you mentioned yesterday? You already mentioned one or two examples actually, but what's the major media bias? That's for Dr. Tessa Huiton, and then for Mas Alisa Hamzah. Am I right to mention your name? There are two kinds of censorship. One is external censorship. In your presentation yesterday, you mentioned Wahyu, SMS stories, and MCMU. And then there are internal censorship. It means that it's same meaning with Malaysian, bahasa Malaysian, Indonesian. From the government or especially from Minister of Information. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start. I'll try not to get into kind of arcane academic arguments here. Objectivity and balance are related, but not exactly the same thing, I guess. In terms of journalistic objectivity, it's linked, I guess, to the practice that reply. So there's a lack of balance there. The other way that we could think about it is having a balanced media system overall in Malaysia. At the moment, there isn't a balanced system. The media landscape is dominated by political economic control by the governing coalition. Papers, I'm not necessarily 100% against media publications having a bias in one direction. I mean, I think that's common even in kind of the developed world or the Western world. There are papers, television stations that are known to be slightly more pro one party than the other. But in most other systems, there will be a span of bias. So there'll be a paper that supports the Labour Party, a paper that supports the National Party or whatever. I'm using to go back and do a frame analysis to look at the dominant kind of frames that are being used. What I have had a chance to start doing some headline analysis, so just looking at the headlines within the publications. And from that analysis, which again this is preliminary, kind of my opinions of what is emerging from that analysis, is that the main form of bias or the main frames that emerged to me were kind of this dichotomy between stability and instability. Barisan Nasional is stable, they're going to grow the economy, they're experienced, they're unified, they're moderate. Whereas the opposition is often painted as being very unstable, full of conflict between the constituent parties, disorganised.
There's a lot of self-censorship, and I think Mas in a small study indicated that there invariably tend to be, primarily because they feel that there's no point in writing this stuff because it's going to be spiked in any case, right? So that they internalize these controls, they internalize these so-called rules that they have to adhere to. Yeah? So there are those external and there are this internal internal controls as well. And many times we would send it months before the printing, the present year's printing permit had expired. But nonetheless, we would not hear for many months whether we would get a permit or not. And there were times when, you know, at that point in time, there were instances when printing permits could be discontinued or would not be given with no actual reasons given why. Of course, this supposedly has changed with the amendments that to the printing permit.
Of all publications that have a regularity to them in terms of how it's published. So for newspapers, you need a license to print, to run a printing permit, license to run a printing press, to print the media, as well as a permit to distribute the newspapers. So that is something that is given upon application if the Home Ministry, which guards these things, agrees that this is what you need to, this is what is allowed of you. Overhaul that is needed was not done. Actually, for groups that advocate for media freedom, for media independence, etc., we would argue that the Printing Presses and Publications Act need to be abolished. It is a law that is a dinosaur in this day and age when information can be gotten at people's hands if they go to the internet, for example. And in one of the, find that for one broadcast media, for example, they have an interactive platform online for Astro Awani, for example, where if you go to the website, you can see that the viewers are actually complaining. We are paying viewers and we are only seeing lopsided coverage. Why is that? You know, we will organize ourselves and, you know, take away our, you know, we won't sign up for your Astro station, etc. and all that. These were the threats that were made online. And for a group that advocates for media freedom, when we want to find out some of the issues faced in the newsroom, it is actually very hard because people don't want to go forward. Been taken to task by the Home Ministry over that. What happened is that news media actually have, one, they had to suspend 2 journalists, yeah, to respond to not just the KDN demands, but also demand by the larger public. It's not a big demand, but there are groups that will say, why are you doing this? You have an agenda, etc. The newspapers were burned. So they had to respond to that. And this is what happens. And that's something that we know. What we don't know, for example, is like, say, for radio. I know that through...
Grant. So that's the point about cosmetic. It was previously say absolute discretion. Now it removes the word absolute discretion. But then it's followed very closely by another provision, this section 6. The minister may at any time revoke or suspend a permit for any period he considers desirable. So it immediately, that's section 6 removes absolute discretion. Section 6(2) then puts this in. And then there is section 13A1, which previously said that the decision cannot be questioned in any court of law. Now it says that that ouster clause is...
we can be pontificating, we can be moralizing, but in any context, in any part of the world, politicians play up on the fears of people. And they look at the cracks of the society. So even if you have a free society, there's no break placed on any politician to play up a nationalist issue, a race issue, a religion issue. So now the question is, in our elections so far, we have always seen that these issues are being played up. In some sense, the playing up of these issues helps the opposition cause, with media or no media, because people are frightened when they see certain parties play up race and religious issues. And they make up their mind that I'm not going to vote for this kind of a party or this kind of coalition because of this.
Arousing ethnic politics. So how do you perceive that this should be regulated? Is it through severe sanctions, or is it through having political parties that are non-racial in composition, or what? So that's precisely the point that was also made by the chairman. So maybe you can address this particular question now.
Ownership of newspapers.
Yes. So we have, I think, just this issue, and then of course there are another 4 issues that were addressed, and the point of the matter that's being made now is what do you see as suggested reforms in respect of this 5 or 6 areas that would be helpful to advance the cause of balanced democracy? So maybe, I think, we start off with this, and then we deal with the question of regulating or restricting ownership of media by political parties, for example. So maybe this one first, about this rousing ethnic. How do you see as a solution?
I think that Mas and Rom are better placed to make recommendations about Malaysia, but what I can maybe do that is possibly useful is share the situation in New Zealand in the way that it's dealt with in New Zealand, which I feel is, I don't think any solution or any system is perfect, but I think New Zealand is pretty good overall in terms of press freedom. The Press Council, its members are made up of a combination of public and industry representatives. There are representatives from different sides of the political spectrum. There tend to be senior lawyers involved, and then other kind of public persons to have public representation as well. Different interest groups are all represented. Any complaints, any issues, any perceptions that the media have not followed their codes of ethics, be they the broadcasting standards or the Press Council's codes of ethics, those can be brought to those different authorities. It doesn't have to go through a kind of usual legal court. It goes through the tribunals or the authorities established by the Act and by the Press Council. That independent authority, and it is truly independent insofar as it can be, assesses complaints and then deals out penalties. So some of the penalties include if a newspaper is found to have trespassed in terms of following its ethics, they have to publish a front page ad saying, sorry, basically, we said this, it was out of line, it was contravening our ethics, we apologise. Another penalty that can be applied in terms of broadcasting is that they're not allowed to advertise for a full day. So it's an economic penalty, essentially. But it's never a...
Trample underfoot, yeah, that community then comes to their side, so to speak, because it's saying the opposition is going to lead to, voting the opposition is going to lead to your whole rights being removed and so on and so forth. So when you have that kind of situation where there's diverse communities, right, it doesn't really work that way. Yeah, they're not too bothered about the minority communities that may jump to the opposition side. They're more concerned, or let's say the urban electorate who are more critical in that sense. They're more concerned about the rural population, perhaps, that will, based on these so-called fears, will tend to vote for them. That's, I think, the argument, the assertion that they have, the feelings that they have. They play up the fears of a community that has less access to alternative forms of explanation, for example. Yeah, I must mention something about in the internet. Yeah, I think what she missed out there is that there's very limited access in those communities to the internet. One, in terms of the language that's used, and two, in terms of actual access to the internet. Yeah, I think yesterday Mas mentioned that age also plays an important role here. Yeah, the older folks have less abilities to work on the internet, which is why, for example, some newspapers are sold of media, for example, right? But having establishing those laws is going to be a problem. It has been, as it has been, for example, with self-regulation, this code of ethics. Yeah, this idea of a code of ethics has been around, I think, since the 1970s. Yeah, and it's been floated around. The Human Rights Commission in Malaysia brought it up in the 1980s and 1990s, I think, and called a lot of stakeholders to the table, right? And nothing, well, virtually nothing has come out of it in that sense, primarily because there are two views as to what a code of ethics ought to be. One is a self-regulated one, and the other one is one that's going to be imposed by the state, by the government. And this constantly coming up with this idea that there needs to be that kind of regulation, not self-regulation, but state-imposed. And the many people who are opposed to that, yeah, recently that idea has come up again. Yeah, so it all depends on the power structures, I feel. Yeah, unfortunately, if we push aside the power structures, I think we're going to be talking without really understanding the context. Yeah, so the code of ethics is fine, but whether...
And if the council could help with regard to the details of that. But there is an Anti-Monopoly Act, but that act is new, fairly new, and has not been used to challenge the monopoly of, for example, Media Prima, which owns all of the TV stations and some print as well. So that's one. Two, in terms of how journalists are organized, as mentioned by Professor Harum, there's a union that has membership, and that union is actually only for print media. If I'm not mistaken, it's only for print and only for Peninsula, because also of the the way with which the country is structured. Unions cannot straddle both East Malaysia as well as Peninsula. And I was a journalist for 10 years and a member of that union. So we tried when we were members of that union at the delegates conference to ask for online media to also be part of that union. There is a clause there which, to my knowledge, has not been changed, which allows for institute. So that they also actually have their own code of ethics in terms of code of conduct for journalists. So all these things are out there. In 1999, a group of journalists with no name, no organization, etc., actually put together a petition asking the government then to repeal the Printing Presses and Publications Act and set up an independent media council. These were two of the few demands that were asked. So that one has no organization attached to it. Some of them later became Initiative Wartawan, the loose group that I mentioned earlier. So in that sense, there are some pockets of organization, but if you're talking about structured groups, etc., then it would be the National Union of Journalists, as well as the smaller groups that are operating. There is a need, I think, for online media journalists, given that there's been a burst in terms of online publications that are happening. So the need for that, and perhaps if you're talking about remedial measures, for if we want to see some kind of self-regulated, driven by journalists themselves, media council, maybe an online media council. That's one way with which to go. Religion being something that comes up all the time. I think race and religion, and in Malaysia, a lot of the structures are, the formation is along the lines of ethnicity and race, whether it's political party all the way to policies, government policies, affirmative action, etc. When that happens, then there is like a larger understanding and you know that this is how you define yourself. So the state prescribes this for you, and this is how you define yourself as a quote-unquote Malay, Chinese, Indian, etc. Dan lain-lain, that famous phrase. So I think in 2008, post-elections, because the BN-linked parties lost a lot of political support, and that was the beginning of the erosion of political support for them, in 2008 you could see race and religion being played together, the twins of race and religion. These two were used together. In 2012, and I think out of the awakening that is happening among society, race has actually dropped a bit below. It's actually religion now that is used more as a card that is drawn out to, instill fear, to instill hatred.
Whether there are any sort of other questions, and some that can be addressed, some many pressing questions that can be addressed, because, or maybe even in writing, that can be responded to by the...
I had one small question, but if there's time, we can discuss it later. And this is the impact of the international and regional media on politics, elections, other issues in Malaysia. Because in some countries, the impact of international media is quite powerful, but perhaps not so here.
So maybe a very brief rejoinder to that, the impact of international media.
The international media does operate, and is something that we do have access to. The kind of censorship that is applied to us is also applicable to some extent to the broadcast especially.
With your leave, then perhaps we can, and if there are any questions, I'm sure in writing, I'm sure the witnesses could agree. So please make yourself available, at least for us to access you, if there are indeed some questions that the panel would wish to raise.
I have some questions, but I'll put it in writing in view of the time.
Thank you very much indeed. So thank you very much, Professor Zarom, Associate Professor Dr. Houghton, and Mas Dalija. Our next witness is Dr. Wong Chin Huan, who's going to take us through gerrymandering and malapportionment, and this will be under the first heading of the typology, which deals with manipulation of electoral...
Institute?
Pardon?
What is the Penang Institute?
It's a think tank attached to the Penang state government.
Can you, before proceeding, can you give us briefly short, I'm sure your resume, your CV is very, very long, but Just a short, what are you doing now and your expertise?
I gained my PhD from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom on a thesis on electoral system and party system in West Malaysia, 1982 to 2004. I have been active in the Brazil and Brazil 2.0 coalitions. At the moment, I'm a fellow at Penang Institute, working on electoral system and decentralization.
And can you tell us what is the Penang Institute?
Penang Institute is a think tank funded and sponsored by the Penang state government.
And it is independent?
I would not say it's independent in the sense that where Penang is concerned, but I do exercise my academic freedom.
And this is as a result of that freedom, expression of your freedom?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Will it be worth 64%? Now, if you combine the Barisan Nasional, the Pakatan Rakyat together, the value is about 79%. If a vote for BN is 126%, while a vote for PR is 79%, basically we are talking about a vote for BN is 1.6 times of a vote for PR. Next, please. Using the same methodology, this is what we have. Since 1955, the first national election in Malaya before the independence. As you can see, I would like to draw your attention to 1986. You can see there the second largest opposition party was PAS. Now, a vote for BN in 1986 was worth 40.41 votes for PAS. What did it mean? In 1986, PAS gained about 15% of votes, but it won only one seat, less than about 0.5, around 0.5%. So that's what it means. Now, as you can see, that's not actually the worst case, because infinity would be larger than 40. And that means that if you win decision party that was more national in terms of their support, the distributions of their voters. In comparison, you'll find that, for example, in 1955 and throughout later, PAS has always been the better, the more beneficiary party until 2008 among the Malay-based opposition because it has much more concentrated support. So the system penalizes on national party if you're not big enough. Now, the second type of party that constantly get penalized by the system are those that mark in red. In 1964, SF stands for the Socialist Front. As you can see, one vote for the Alliance then was worth 12 votes for Socialist Front. And then you have Perkamas, a tiny party led by Tan Sri Kun. In 1974 and 1978, and PSRM, that's the Socialist People Party in 1982 and 1986. The leftist party were penalized because the class votes are not as concentrated as the communal votes. It's the interstate malapportionment, the other one is intrastate malapportionment. One got worse after 1963 and 73, the other one after 73. Now, in the early independence years, the apportionment was mathematically determined. For the interstate apportionment, it was by proportions of electorate and populations. Intrastate was strictly by proportions of electorate. Next, please. For interstate malapportionment, in 1963, when Malaysia was formed, with 4 countries coming together, that's Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore, there was deliberate unequal apportionments of federal seats for them. Sabah and Sarawak were deliberately overrepresented, while Singapore was deliberately underrepresented vis-a-vis to Malaya. That left us a legacy until today, whereby you combine the seats in East Malaysia, they constitute a quarter of the federal parliament, despite their electorate is only 1/6 of the national electorate. Since 1973, the federal 1973, because at the beginning the cap was 15%, and then it was raised to about 33.33%. After 1973, there was no longer any cap. But this does not mean it's a blank check for malapportionment, which we'll see in what happened in practice soon. Secondly, when the malapportionment is specifically meant to be pro-rural. Next, please. In 2011, in the run-up to Basel 2.0, the Election Commission produced this booklet. On page 12, it reviewed, to my knowledge, for the first time, a scheme of malapportionment. Next, please. It says, for parliamentary, where parliamentary constituencies are concerned, an urban seat would have 60,000 or more, and a rural seat would have 30,000 or less. In between would be the semi-urban. For the state constituency, the floor for urban seats would be 25,000, the ceiling for rural seats 15,000, and in between would be semi-urban. Now the guide is flawed in 3 ways, constitutionally, because there's nothing to give way to a 3-tier malapportionment scheme. As we can see, lies at the border of the state of Kedah with Thailand and Perak. It's mountainous and hilly. It was at one point known in Malaysian history for the negotiation between the Communist Party and the government, because that's where the guerrilla would have come down from the mountain. So it's very hilly. And Alor is in the plain, is the capital town of the state. Now, if you go back to 2004, that's 1 year after the constituency redonation in 2003. And so it would faithfully reflect the situation that the EC was considering before it. In that year, Alor has 74,000, nearly 75,000 voters, while, Baling has 75,000 voters, and Alor has only 57,000. If you go back to the scheme could you go back to the previous slide? You go back to the scheme, you would know that Baling would have qualified as an urban seat, while the state capital of Alor is actually a semi-urban seat. That's geography for you from the Election Commission. Next, please. It was a 61% Chinese constituency. So that was, Kinrara was a mixed seats, sorry for that typo. Kinrara was a mixed seats with a Chinese majority. But you look at the size. In 2004, Sri Sudan has about 40,000, while Kinrara only 20,000. Practically, we are saying here that if you live in a constituency like Sri Sudan, whereby the ethnic Malay form a majority, you get half of a chance of your lawmaker attention compared to your neighbor who live in a seat with a Chinese majority. And we wonder why would this happen. If you look at the 2008 result, then the answer was quite clear. In 2008, the Sri Sudan seat, the electorate for Sri Sudan seat had grown to about 50,000. And in that election, about nearly 38,000 people voted. It was a very fierce competition. And UMNO won it with a slim majority, a slim margin of 45 votes. How do we make sense of this? The support base for UMNO in the urban area has become so weak that it could manipulation by altering the electorate composition. conceptually what it means is that if you have two constituencies with the same types of demography, you can change the outcome by changing the boundary. So on the one on the left, you would find that with a slight majority on the blue side, the blue party can only win one seat, constituency X. The red party can still win constituency Y. So in that sense, the blue party is slightly underrepresented, but the red party is slightly overrepresented, but that's probably the most ideal situation you can have, because at almost even, two even sides would have representation in the parliament. Now, by altering the the constituency boundary, you transfer 8 units of blue voters in exchange of 8 units of red voters. Now, the blue voters would dominate both, the blue party would dominate both constituencies. And the implication for democracy is that you do not need to compete in policy. Politics is no longer economics, no longer sociology. It is reduced to geography. It's a matter of how you organize yourself effectively. Produce a parliament, a legislature that is more representative than otherwise to allow democracy to work. Next, please. Now, what we have in the Constitution on or against gerrymandering is rather limited. There's 3 parts that touch on boundary, and 2 parts are a bit more related. One is actually about a prohibition of crossing state boundaries by parliamentary constituency, and then as far as possible, avoidance of state constituency crossing the boundaries of parliamentary constituency. That part is followed fully. The other part is the last one. Regards ought to be had to the inconveniences attendant on alterations of constituency and to the maintenance of local ties. This is where I shall show the evidence. Next, please. Sorry for that repetition. Next, please. Next, please. Okay. This is gerrymandering type 1. You have constituency that cross municipal or district boundaries, because that's actually not provided in the Constitution. This is Selangor, and the color would show different jurisdictions of municipalities or district, while the line would show the boundary of state constituency. Selat Klang, that's N45, which is about half an hour from here. As you can see from the map, Selat Klang consists of 2 parts, an urban enclave and a few offshore islands. They were not even connected. There is no way you can establish by common sense that how this electorate may share some common interests. A more common sensual way of drawing the constituency would have include the islands next to Pelabuhan Klang, which is the one in light blue. And those are the situations that the EC should have taken into consideration. But you see anomaly as such. Next, please. And thirdly, the EC has no problem in partitioning neighborhood. Again, this is actually just about 10 minutes away from here. This is...
Can I have the name of that unusual constituency?
Next, please.
The
Going
one,
back
earlier
to
one,
the previous one.
This
This is Pelabuhan. The one that is odd one is Selat Klang.
Selat.
N45.
And just now, just to clarify, you said the blue. Which is the blue you're
The
talking
one
about?
immediately after, next to it.
Can you show?
Next, please. But you have more interesting things that I cannot find an academic term to describe it. Because this is, strictly speaking, not even gerrymandering. But it incorporates the spirit, the core spirit of gerrymandering. What it means is this. Now you have this address, 278D Kampung Abdullah, 85,000 Gamat, that's in the southernmost state of Johor on the peninsula. Before the 2003 constituency redelineation, the entire address was part of the people living on that at that address were all included in P125, 125 Segamat. After the constituency redelineation in 2003, Mr. Ong stayed put at Segamat, is now P140, and the state seats NO2 Jermonta, while his wife, Mrs. Ong, and the remainings of the families have now moved to P141 Skijang, NO3 Permanis. Now, if we were to believe that the EC has done a fantastic job, we must conclude that the constituency boundary cut across. Now, our population at the same time has turned from 9.5 million to 25 million. It sounds normal. It sounds normal only as far as you think Malaysia is the standard. If you look at America, in 1911, we're talking about 1911, the lower house of the Congress, the House of Representatives, had 435 voting members. At that time, the population of America was 94 million, or at least discouraged. But over time, you have new generations of politicians coming up. They want new seats. You have parties who have grown stronger over time, while others grown weaker. So how do you deal with that contradiction? You can't take away a seat from one party and not leaving the party unhappy. So the way was actually to increase new seats so that you change, you alter the proportions of the component parties in terms of the seats allocated to them without changing the absolute number as far as possible. That news was in 2008. What we have heard and in the past few days and until this presentation, basically they are all interrelated. The problem has to go back to 1969. Multi-party democracy was practically dead after 1969. With political freedom restricted, opposition parties co-opted or suppressed, and the permissions of party, here what I mean by UMNO, and to a larger extent to BN, into the state, economy, and society of Malaysia in the name of social engineering. We are actually an electoral one-party state. What I mean is that we are one-party state with election. The only difference between us, with countries like People's Republic of China, with Vietnam, with North Korea, is that they are probably a little bit more upfront. They don't pretend to be democracy. And you have the words from, and some people like to blame it on, what we have in the GE13. Some people would like to blame it on the Prime Minister Najib Razak. I think that's very unfair. The credit would have to go back to his late father, the second Prime Minister, Tun Abdul Razak Hussein. He has a very different, a very interesting philosophical view of how politics should be conducted in Malaysia, he says. In our Malaysian society of today, where racial manifestations are very much for the parties to engineer its renewal and its legitimizations of power. Now, there are two flaws in the current process. One is that you have a very partial EC, virtually unconstrained, despite whatever provision we have in the Constitution. Second is that you need only a simple majority to pass the EC recommendation on redelineation. That's provided in the 13th schedule of the Federal Constitution. The reform we would have is that I think we need to reform the EC. You have two options. One is to create a separate boundary commission. In some countries that practice in that way, there are countries that are moving back to combine everything in one single commission. The other option, I suppose, is that to reform the EC entirely, you have two options. One is to make it more non-partisan. At the moment, the problem is that we have retired senior civil servants to hold the post, and they have been taking orders from the politician for 30, 40 years in their life, and suddenly you want them to be to stand up against the politician. That's a bit too challenging for them. And secondly, is to forget about this idea that we could actually have non-partisan body. We can consider the other alternative implemented in some post-authoritarian country, former one-party state. They simply have a multi-partisan election body. so that you have the party representative in it, everyone fight for their party interests, and therefore they provide a check and balance. Now about the reforming the really, let's say 500,000 votes, I only need to change maybe 50,000 votes, and in let's say 50 constituency where the margin is 1,000. So that make it much more profitable for you to cheat. Secondly, and I'd like to come back and make a reference to the earlier presentations about sedition and ethnic tension. I think there is a mismatch between the electoral system and our social structure. Malaysia is basically a bipolar society where you have two groups with considerably equal power. The Malay Muslim and the non-Malay non-Muslim. Of course, you have a tiny minorities of non-Malay Bumiputras in between. But roughly you have two major blocks. And the problem with bipolar society is that people tend to be very careful in comparing with each other, in give and take. All we need to do is to recall back our primary school days. Do you recall the boy or the girl, the boys or the girls who got number 1 and number 2 in class? Were they good friends? It's quite unlikely they can be good friends. The party vote will determine the allocations of all seats. Parties will be given compensatory seats from the party list after deducting their gain in constituency contests. What it means is this. If party A wins 35% of votes for 200 seats parliament, the party should get 70 seats in total. Now, if it has already won 50 constituency, it will be given 20 more party list seats. On the other hand, if it wins 20 constituency, it will be given 50 party list seats. So it actually it can actually eliminate completely the incentive for you to manipulate on constituency redelineation. Whatever you gain from the constituency would be offset by your loss in the party list. Next, please. And the likely advantages is more democratic in allocations of seats. That's quite clear-cut. There would be no chance of having a manufactured majority government like what we have today. It keeps constituency representation, which enables local needs to be taken care of. It eliminates the incentive to cheat. It allows the demographic diversifications of parliamentarians by encouraging representations of certain groups, women, minority, expert through the party list. Possible disadvantage, it may result in proliferations of parties and emergence of extremist party, but Germany and
require from the political parties, I think I know the answer, but I just want to hear, what will it take for them to, as you say, reform the redelineation exercise? And secondly, what will it take, or are you really suggesting that it's possible to change the electoral system?
in the short run, I mean, providing we want to have a limited reform, then I think one way is actually to go back to keep first past the post, but we impose much more restriction. The problem with the constitutional amendments to respond, and only three types of bodies can respond: the state governments, the local authorities, and any groups of 100 voters. The problem is really about that. You can fight that process, but you'll be given only twice the chances to do so, because every time you propose, you present your protest, your objection to it, the EC is bound to call for an inquiry, and after that, if you change the boundary, and then you can go back to the process again. But after twice, the EC is not legally bound to do anything. And once the moment it goes to Parliament, it can be passed with any government that enjoy a simple majority. So my proposal is to say, break it. Perhaps you go through a two-stage process. You go to the state assembly for the approval of the state constituency. Then, if that is passed through, you go to Parliament, and perhaps something stronger than simple majority. And as on the electoral system, yes, I would think that we need to thoroughly consider
state approval. What you mean is that even for the federal constituencies, it must get state approval?
No. Let me explain a little bit. Our system is the state constituency.
The result could be disproportionate.
Result can be?
Sorry?
the result can be manipulated and to...
Yes, because how you get elected, whether, I don't follow the details, I'll need to recall.
Yeah.
But I understand from experts, electoral experts, that MMP is subject to manipulation in a way other systems of PR are not.
Yeah.
But you stopped at MMP, but didn't go on to discuss
Yes.
alternatives of proportionality.
Thank you. Certainly that every electoral system can be subject to manipulation, but they're subject to different types of manipulation. So if you have you have a proportional representation, of which MMP is a variant, one major problem is that you create very strong parties compared to first past the post. But in the context of Malaysia, that's probably not a problem because the parties are already very strong. So the further detrimental effect would not be that much. But there's one thing that MNP definitely can address in the Malaysian context. At the moment when we look at the manipulation, it's very much to do with playing with the boundary. The ethnic Malays who support the opposition are at the losing end.
Mr. Council?
Yes.
I have one comment and one question. And I think you just answered the comment I had, and that was the table you produced on anti-Malay malapportionment. In the past, would you agree with me that in the past, gerrymandering was actually to give an advantage to Malays who are primarily living in the rural areas? Now gerrymandering is to give advantage to the BN, so it's more partisan rather than ethnic-based. And therefore, your table here, which is anti-Malay, is a little misleading. It's just that in the urban areas, this is the kind of situation, but it doesn't give a complete picture. Only that particular constituencies that you showed tended to give a bias towards semi-urban and urban areas. I wonder whether you would agree with me with that. The second thing is a question I have to ask you, and that is, to what extent would you say that the discrepancy between votes and seats obtained in Parliament is due to our first past the post system or due to gerrymandering? Thank you.
The first question, your first comment, I think what I want to suggest is that the nature of first past the post does provide the incentive for people to cheat. And unless you have an impartial election commissions, a boundary commission, that become easy. Because what we can effectively check, what is more easier to check is malapportionment, because you just look at the deviations from the mathematical average. What is more difficult is when it comes to gerrymandering. That requires a lot of local knowledge and is actually can be very subjective. And that would come down to, eventually it could be about different teams of experts playing on the data to determine how they should do. And that's always a problem in constituency-based electoral system. So to move away from that is get rid of that concern. But also that first past the post, I would argue, is detrimental to a country like Malaysia because it increases the psychological tensions amongst different different ethnic communities. For one reason, a small swing in votes can result in huge difference in seats. So that makes you feel like, is this the final battle? And that message has always been played. The earlier discussions on the media scene about that the fear and so on can be contextualized in this. If you have a proportional representation system, it's talking about how much more you win.
To state and constituencies. Since, MP is not only represent the voters, but population. So that's why I said, do you have data about that? Or
I don't have it offhand. In the early years, in apportioning seats to the states, the population were actually taken into consideration. The difference between the population electorate, of course, is the exclusions of unregistered voters and the underage mainly. Yeah. So in the past, that was taken into consideration, but I do not have at the moment. But we can roughly guess the pictures that states like Selangor and Penang and all those, Johor, would have a higher growth and so on. So that that if we go by population rather than electorate, the malapportionment could be worse.
Okay, so you're saying that in Malaysia you have, unequal representation. That's your point?
Yes.
Or use the word here, actually the one person, one vote is not guaranteed here in reality, although according to Malaysian constitution, guarantee that principle, one person, one vote. Are you saying that? Yeah.
Could you repeat again? Sorry.
In terms of gerrymandering or malapportionment created by EC and Parliament, because EC just drafting and then require what simple majority agreement from a member of Parliament. So where this the what do you call the cause of this problem?
It's actually two parts. Is it possible to shift to my SD? There's a chart that I can show it perhaps a bit clearer. If you can go to page, accidentally I left that out, it's page 11. You go to page 11 of my SD. Sorry that I can only show it to the panelists. The bar would show the average size of parliamentary seats in Malaysia. The different bars would show the average size of the bar would and to that effect they were given over-representation. And Sabah and Sabahan see that as their birthright because they were much more backward. So that became a check to protect themselves, which is unusual because if you look at a normal federation system, the more usual way is to ensure over-representation in the upper house, and you make the upper house powerful to check on this, and not undermining equal representation in the lower house.
You suggested that the either non-partisan EC or special commission to establish the constituency.
Yeah, another option is to have a multi-partisan EC. As in some former communist country, they don't believe that you can actually be non-partisan, so they make it explicit partisan. So you have party-nominated representatives sitting in the same room. They have to deal with each other's interests, and they sort of compromise on that.
My question is, was there public participation in reviewing? But conclusion in Malaysia is the unequal representation is
It's a
exception or as a norm?
It's a norm here, unfortunately. And it's a norm that unchallenged because I think partly the electoral system, as my larger argument, this was to preserve the one-party state established after 1969. So until we are challenging that, this would not happen. That gives the context on all those electoral manipulation and fraud that's happening because it's actually systematic.
Thank you.
Yes. If there are no other questions, can I just can you just roll that segamat, the breakup of the segamat?
One bit.
No, not this one. The
one bed, two constituencies.
yes, the one, the two, one bed, two constituencies. But the P140 and P141 and P125 is what I'm.
Yeah.
Yes. Now this refers to this Kampung Abdullah. Just to ask, is arbitrary, and that it destroys the identity. This is your point: the identity and unity of the community.
Yeah, but also here, the point I want to draw that is actually deliberate allocating voters in disregard of even the geographical location. The idea of gerrymandering is to disregard the substantial social condition that inform the proper definitions of a political community. In this case, even the geographical location, the exact geographical location is disregarded because you live in the same place, but some members of the family can be allocated here while others to another constituency. I have had a conversation with Mr. Ong, younger brothers. He believed that it was because Mr. Ong was a staunch supporter, a well-known staunch supporter of the opposition.
Yeah, in fact, in this regard, is SD 66 before Your Honours? Or we present SD 66, which is the SD that, which is the Mr. Ong that has been referred to. And if I could just have a short break?
Yes, all right.
Yes, 15 minutes break, yes. And we wish to thank you, Dr. Wong.
Thank you.
Can he be released, please?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, for your
Thank you.
testimony.
All rise.